They called them the amateurs. In the winter of 1944, deep in the forests of Belgium, German officers looked over their maps and laughed. They mocked the Americans. Farm boys with rifles, they said, untested, inexperienced, lacking the discipline of the Wehrmacht. The German High Command believed they could break the US Army with one final ferocious push. They were wrong. When the Battle of the Bulge began, snow fell like ash. American soldiers, the GIs, were scattered, outnumbered and freezing in the Ardennes. Yet in those woods they fought like men possessed. The laughter of the German officers faded fast, replaced by disbelief and fear. This is the story of how ordinary men, truck drivers, clerks, farmhands and factory workers, became the iron wall that stopped Hitler's last great offensive. It's a story of courage, sacrifice and defiance. Of young Americans who refused to run when the entire German war machine came crashing toward them. From the chaos at Bastogne to the heroism of isolated platoons cut off behind enemy lines. This is not just a story of victory. It's a story of grit, blood, and brotherhood. Because when the German officers finally met the GIs in battle, they didn't find amateurs. They found soldiers who would rather die than yield an inch of Europe back to tyranny. It began with arrogance, the kind that comes from years of victory. In 1944, German officers had seen Europe crumble under the power of their armies. They had marched through France, crushed Poland and defied every Allied attempt to stop them. So when word reached the command posts that fresh American troops were arriving on the Western Front, many officers scoffed. To them, these GIs were nothing more than untested boys from across the ocean, farmhands and factory workers playing at war. They were convinced that the Americans lacked discipline, that they relied on machines instead of courage, that they couldn't possibly stand against the might of the Wehrmacht. Around campfires and in command tents, the laughter was common. German intelligence reports even described American forces as poorly coordinated and tactically naive. Officers of the panzer divisions mocked the Allies' insistence on massive logistical lines, saying they could never react quickly in a fluid battle. They compared the GIs to a blunt hammer, loud, strong, but clumsy. They believed the Americans would crumble under pressure, just as they thought the British had at Dunkirk. But beneath their pride, the cracks in Germany's war machine were already showing. By mid-1944, the tide of the war had begun to turn. After D-Day, the Americans were no longer the green troops who had landed nervously on the beaches of Normandy. They had fought through the hedgerows, crossed rivers under fire and survived brutal counterattacks. Every skirmish hardened them, turning frightened recruits into battle-hardened veterans. Yet to the German command, these changes went unnoticed, or worse, dismissed. They still clung to the belief that their soldiers were superior in every way. In late 1944, Hitler planned one last desperate gamble, a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, aimed at splitting the Allied lines and capturing the port of Antwerp. It would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The plan relied on surprise, weather and arrogance, the assumption that American forces stationed in the Ardennes were too inexperienced to respond effectively. Many of the units holding the line were indeed newly arrived, resting after long campaigns, or inexperienced replacements sent to quieter sectors. To the German generals, it looked like an easy victory, a chance to strike back and remind the world of Germany's power. In the frozen forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, the Germans gathered in silence. Thousands of tanks, guns and vehicles waited under the cover of snow-laden trees. Soldiers whispered in the cold air, their breath rising like ghosts. Among them, officers spoke confidently. They believed they would smash through the American lines within days, that panic would spread among the ranks, and that the amateur army would collapse. They joked that the Americans wouldn't even notice the attack until it was too late. But on the other side of those quiet hills, the Americans were not as blind or as weak as the Germans imagined. While many were resting or preparing for Christmas, others were quietly watching the enemy's movements. Small reconnaissance patrols had reported unusual German activity, engine noises at night, troop movements in the mist. Some commanders grew uneasy, sensing something coming. But higher headquarters doubted the enemy's ability to launch a large-scale offensive in such terrible weather. Snowstorms raged across the region, grounding Allied planes and reducing visibility to almost nothing. It was the perfect moment for Germany's last strike. When dawn broke on December 16, 1944, the sky erupted. Over 1,500 German artillery guns opened fire in unison, shaking the ground for miles. The bombardment tore through American positions, destroying communication lines and scattering units in confusion. Then through the fog came the rumble. Panzer tanks advancing through the white forests, black crosses glinting through the smoke. Columns of German infantry followed, confident and fast. Overrunning American outposts caught completely off guard. For the Germans, it felt like the old days again. Fast, overwhelming, unstoppable. Officers cheered as they watched American lines bend under the pressure. Some laughed, shouting, "See? They run just like we said." But they didn't realize something vital. The Americans weren't collapsing. They were falling back, reorganizing and preparing to fight. The German officers saw panic. What they were really seeing was controlled chaos, a desperate but determined effort to survive the opening blow. In the chaos of that first day, entire American units were cut off. Young GIs fought from frozen foxholes, clutching rifles with numb fingers, firing blindly through the snow. They weren't polished or perfectly trained, but they refused to surrender. At Bastogne, St. Vith, and other small towns scattered through the Ardennes, they dug in and held on with everything they had. German officers who expected a quick breakthrough were suddenly facing fierce resistance at every turn. Tanks were delayed, bridges blown, supply convoys ambushed. The laughter that had filled German command tents began to fade, replaced by irritation and disbelief. Still, in those early days, the Germans believed they were winning. The offensive was working. The Americans were retreating, and the front was bending outward, forming a great bulge in the Allied lines. To the German generals, it seemed their mockery had been justified. But behind the smoke and gunfire, something was changing. The Americans were learning, fast. Units that had been caught by surprise were now regrouping. Artillerymen who had fled under bombardment returned to their guns. Communication lines were restored. Commanders began improvising defenses, using every resource they could find to stall the German advance. What the German officers failed to understand was that the Americans weren't fighting for Hitler's vision or a strategic goal. They were fighting for each other, for the man in the next foxhole, for the buddies they'd lost, and for a cause they believed was just. That difference, that stubborn human determination, was about to turn the laughter of the German high command into silence. When the offensive began on December 16, 1944, it came like a thunderclap. For weeks the snow-covered Ardennes had been eerily quiet. The American soldiers stationed there believed they were in a rest sector, a peaceful stretch of the front where nothing much ever happened. They decorated pine trees with ration tins, wrote letters home and dreamed of a Christmas far away from war. The last thing anyone expected was a German attack. But before dawn the stillness shattered. The ground trembled beneath the roar of more than 1,000 German artillery guns, unleashing one of the most intense bombardments of the entire war. Shells screamed overhead, bursting through trees and sending splinters flying like shrapnel. Entire American units were buried alive in snow and mud. Communication lines were torn apart, radios went silent, and for the first few hours no one knew what was happening. Then came the tanks, dark shapes emerging through the fog and snow, their iron tracks grinding the frozen earth. Behind them marched thousands of German infantrymen, their breath steaming in the cold, their uniforms white with camouflage smocks, their orders simple: break through, drive west, and split the Allied front in two. For the American troops caught in their path, chaos reigned. The men of the 106th Infantry Division, young, inexperienced replacements fresh from the States, were among the first to be hit. They had been told their position was safe, that the enemy in front of them was weak and disorganized. Instead, they found themselves facing elite panzer units, hardened veterans who had fought on the Eastern Front. Within hours, American outposts were overrun, and entire regiments were surrounded. Trucks burned in the snow. Radios crackled with desperate messages. "We're cut off. Need reinforcements now." In German command posts, officers smiled grimly as reports came in of progress. Villages that had been quiet only yesterday were now under German control again. They believed the plan was unfolding perfectly. Hitler himself, watching from his headquarters, called it his final victory. He wanted to divide the British and American armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate peace. It was a plan born of desperation, but fueled by arrogance. The officers who led the attack laughed at the idea that the Americans could regroup. "Once they taste our steel," one colonel reportedly said, "they will run." But the Americans did not run. In the town of St. Vith, small groups of GIs held crossroads under constant attack. They fired until their machine guns froze, then warmed the barrels with their bare hands. In Bastogne, a key junction in the Ardennes, paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division rushed in to hold the line. They had no winter clothing, little ammunition, and almost no supplies, yet they dug in and refused to yield. The German officers believed they could crush the town in a day. It would take them weeks, and they would never take it at all. Still, during those first days, it looked as though the Germans might actually succeed. Their armored spearheads pushed deep into Allied territory, forming a great bulge in the front lines, hence the name Battle of the Bulge. Panic swept through the rear areas as roads jammed with fleeing vehicles, and rumors spread that the German army was once again unstoppable. But not all the news was good for the attackers. The snow that had concealed their movements also slowed them down. Fuel shortages became critical, and every time a village was captured, American resistance stiffened around it. For the GIs trapped in pockets, it became a test of will. They fought in freezing temperatures, often without food or sleep, surrounded on all sides. When German officers sent demands for surrender, the replies were defiant. In Bastogne, when surrounded by the 2nd Panzer Division, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe famously responded with a single word: nuts. That message, sent back through German lines, became a rallying cry for every American soldier in the Ardennes. Meanwhile, the laughter among German officers began to fade. Reports came in of delays, of unexpected resistance, of villages that refused to fall. Panzer commanders complained of running out of fuel, of Allied artillery hammering their supply routes. American engineers blew bridges behind them, trapping German tanks in narrow valleys. What had started as a confident advance now became a struggle through ice, mud, and chaos. The Germans had underestimated not just American strength, but American stubbornness. Every mile of progress came at a cost. Dead soldiers, burned tanks, wrecked convoys lined the roads. Still, the German command insisted victory was close. They told themselves the Americans were finished, that the Allies had no reserves left to counterattack. But in reality, reinforcements were already on the way. Eisenhower had mobilized everything he had, airborne divisions, armored units, and fresh infantry, to contain the German drive. For the soldiers on the ground, the battle had become a nightmare. The forest was filled with the sounds of distant gunfire and the cries of the wounded. The snow, once pure white, was stained with blood and smoke. GIs huddled in foxholes, shivering, their rifles frozen in their hands. German officers watched through binoculars, confident they were witnessing another triumph. They didn't yet know that their advance, though brutal and swift, was already beginning to crumble under its own weight. They had come expecting a swift, glorious victory over an enemy they didn't respect. What they found instead was something they couldn't understand: an army of ordinary men who refused to give up no matter how hopeless it seemed. And in that frozen wilderness, the arrogance that had fueled the German command would soon turn to disbelief, then to fear, as the laughter that once echoed in their headquarters was drowned out by the thunder of American artillery. The snow kept falling, covering the dead and the living alike. The forest was filled with the dull roar of distant explosions, the sharp cracks of rifles, and the groans of men half buried in snow and smoke. For the Germans, the offensive had begun as a symbol of defiance. Hitler's last gamble, a desperate attempt to split the Allies and turn the war's tide. For the Americans, it was fast becoming a fight for survival. By the third day, the front had dissolved into chaos. Entire units were cut off, scattered through the thick woods, fighting isolated battles against an enemy that seemed to appear from the mist. At Bastogne, the small Belgian town that anchored the southern edge of the German attack, things were worse than anyone imagined. The 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of armor and artillery, found themselves completely surrounded. Supplies were nearly gone, ammunition was running low, and the freezing weather had turned the roads into sheets of ice. Food was rationed to almost nothing. The wounded lay shivering in cellars wrapped in blankets, hoping for rescue that might never come. Yet in that ring of frost and steel, the Americans refused to surrender. Every day, German commanders sent envoys under white flags to demand their capitulation. Each time they received the same answer: nuts. It was a single word, delivered with dry humor by General Anthony McAuliffe. But it became a legend. When German officers read the reply, they were stunned. They couldn't understand it, not the word itself, nor the defiance behind it. To them, surrender was the only rational choice for a force so hopelessly surrounded. But these young GIs, cold and starving, saw it differently. They weren't fighting for tactical ground or medals. They were fighting for each other, for their brothers in the foxholes beside them, for the memory of those who had fallen, and for the belief that freedom was worth every drop of blood in the snow. German officers had come into the Ardennes, confident that the Americans would fold under pressure. They had watched the Allies retreat during the first days of the offensive and mistaken it for panic. But what they were witnessing now was not retreat. It was resistance, quiet and unbreakable. Every hedgerow, every frozen farmhouse became a fortress. American artillery units that had been forced back turned their guns around and fired point blank at advancing German tanks. Infantrymen who had lost contact with their regiments joined other units, forming improvised defenses. Engineers fought as riflemen. Medics became stretcher bearers under fire. The front was no longer organized. It was raw determination made flesh. German tank crews soon found themselves stuck in the narrow forest roads. Allied engineers had blown bridges and planted mines everywhere, turning the terrain into a nightmare. The mighty panzers, symbols of German dominance, were trapped in traffic jams stretching for miles. Fuel was running out. Columns that had once moved with precision now crawled through mud and snow, easy targets for ambushes. American bazooka teams hid in ditches and woods, waiting for the glint of metal through the trees. When the tanks came, they fired, then vanished into the forest. Each explosion echoed like defiance. In the skies above, the weather had begun to shift. For days, the thick clouds had grounded the Allied Air Force, giving the Germans their chance to strike unseen. But now the skies began to clear. By December 23rd, the first streaks of sunlight broke through the clouds, and with them came the sound of engines. Dozens of American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs roared overhead, their silver wings flashing in the cold light. They dove on the German columns below, unleashing rockets and machine gun fire with merciless precision. Fuel convoys exploded, ammunition trucks went up in fireballs, and the frozen forest echoed with chaos. The German offensive, built on secrecy and speed, was suddenly exposed and bleeding. On the ground, German officers could hardly believe what was happening. Their maps no longer matched reality. Their troops were starving, their tanks out of fuel, their supply lines shattered by Allied planes. Orders from Berlin demanded that they push forward, but there was nowhere left to go. For the first time, the laughter in the German command posts stopped. The reports coming in from the front were grim, too grim to ignore. One commander near St. Vith radioed that his men were fighting without food, without sleep, and almost without hope. Another begged for air cover that would never come. Meanwhile, the Americans, those same GIs once dismissed as weak, were counter-attacking. Reinforcements had begun to arrive from the north and south, tightening the noose around the German salient. The 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions pushed forward relentlessly, using every ounce of fuel and ammunition they could gather. Exhausted soldiers fought through nights without sleep, moving from one ruined village to the next. They no longer cared about the cold or the hunger. The only thing that mattered was pushing the enemy back. The forest that had once echoed with German confidence now rang with the sound of American artillery. Every hill and crossroads became a killing ground. The young GIs, the ones who had been laughed at, mocked as inexperienced, now moved with precision and fury. They were no longer just surviving. They were winning. German officers began to realize the truth that none dared to speak aloud. Their last great gamble had failed. The offensive that was supposed to break the Allies had instead broken them. The panzers that had once symbolized strength were now burning wrecks in the snow. The men who had started this battle with laughter were now staring into the cold, hollow eyes of defeat. And still, the Americans kept coming, through the smoke, through the ice, through everything the enemy could throw at them. What had begun as a rout had turned into retribution. The Germans had thought they were fighting soldiers. They had discovered they were fighting a force of will. The GIs had earned their respect the hard way, in the fire and the frost of the Ardennes. By the end of December 1944, the laughter that once filled German command tents had been replaced by quiet desperation. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last hope of splitting the Allied armies, was faltering. What had begun as a bold strike was now collapsing under its own weight. The German officers who had mocked the Americans were beginning to understand that they had gravely miscalculated not just the enemy's strength, but his spirit. What they had thought would be an easy victory had become a grinding battle of attrition fought in freezing forests, shattered villages, and blood-stained snow. The first signs of disaster were subtle. Supply trucks failed to arrive. Fuel reserves dwindled. Ammunition began to run low. The same terrain that had offered the Germans concealment now trapped them. The dense woods, narrow roads, and deep snow turned tank columns into easy targets. As the days passed, the sky, once their ally, betrayed them. The weather cleared, and the Americans unleashed the one force the Germans could no longer match: air power. From dawn to dusk, American fighter bombers scoured the skies over the Ardennes. The howl of P-47 Thunderbolts echoed through the valleys, followed by the shriek of rockets and the thunder of explosions. German convoys, already weakened by lack of fuel, were torn apart. Columns of burning vehicles stretched for miles. Soldiers who once marched confidently now dove into ditches at the first hint of an engine overhead. The roads that had carried the offensive westward now became graveyards of twisted metal and frozen corpses. On the ground, the Americans were changing the rhythm of the fight. They had stopped retreating. Units that had been scattered or overwhelmed were now reorganized, refitted, and returning to battle with renewed ferocity. Reinforcements poured in. Infantry from the 84th Division, armored units from Patton's Third Army, paratroopers hardened from Normandy and Holland. What had once been isolated pockets of resistance now became a solid, coordinated front. The GIs were learning quickly, adapting to the terrain and the enemy's tactics. They were no longer simply defending. They were hunting. In the town of Bastogne, the men of the 101st Airborne Division still held out against relentless attack. The Germans had encircled the town, cutting off all supply routes. Inside, rations were so scarce that men shared single biscuits among themselves. Artillerymen counted every shell. Medical supplies were nearly gone. The wounded lay in basements wrapped in torn blankets, shivering in the bitter cold. Yet not one man suggested surrender. When German officers once again demanded it, the Americans' reply remained the same: nuts. That single word had spread far beyond Bastogne. It became a symbol of defiance for the entire U.S. Army, proof that no matter how desperate things became, the line would hold. Then came the moment that changed everything. On December 23rd, the weather finally cleared completely. The skies opened, and hundreds of Allied transport planes roared toward Bastogne, parachuting crates of food, medicine, and ammunition into the besieged town. For the men below, it felt like salvation from the heavens. Watching from nearby ridges, German officers could do nothing but curse the sky. Their advantage was gone. The Americans had survived, and now they were being resupplied and reinforced. Meanwhile, General George S. Patton's Third Army was moving north with unbelievable speed. Through blizzards and ice, his tanks plowed across the snow, grinding through villages, cutting through enemy lines. Patton had promised Eisenhower he could pivot his entire army toward Bastogne in just a few days, and he did it. His men fought through minefields, artillery fire, and constant ambushes, pushing themselves beyond exhaustion to reach the surrounded paratroopers. On December 26th, the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division finally broke through. The siege of Bastogne was over. For the Germans, it was the beginning of the end. Their armored divisions, once symbols of invincibility, were now shadows of their former power. Many of their tanks had been abandoned, their crews forced to flee on foot through the forest. Entire units were cut off, their commanders missing or dead. The retreat began not as an order, but as a necessity. What had once been a bold offensive was turning into a nightmare. Retreat under constant attack from the air and ground. The American soldiers who advanced through the wreckage saw firsthand the price of arrogance. Burned-out panzers lined the roads, their blackened hulls half buried in snow. German helmets and rifles lay scattered in the ditches. In some places, American units captured entire battalions that had simply run out of fuel or ammunition. Those German officers who had once boasted of crushing the amateur Americans now stood silent, their faces grey with exhaustion and disbelief. In headquarters across the German front, the tone had changed completely. Reports of delays had turned into reports of disasters. Commanders argued over who was to blame. Some still clung to hope, insisting that another push could turn things around. But deep down they knew the truth. The offensive had failed. The Americans they had laughed at were not only holding their ground, they were winning. And yet, even as the German line began to crumble, the GIs showed no triumphal arrogance. They were too tired, too cold, too aware of the cost. They had lost friends in every village, in every frozen field. For them, victory was not something to celebrate, it was survival. They didn't fight for glory or revenge. They fought because they had no other choice. By the time the year ended, the once proud German advance had been pushed back nearly to where it had begun. The mighty Bulge that had frightened the Allied command was gone. The roads that had once echoed with the rumble of German armor now carried columns of American tanks heading east. The laughter that had started this offensive, the smug confidence that the GIs were weak, had died completely. In its place was silence, broken only by the low rumble of engines and the cries of men clearing the battlefield. The German officers had learned a hard truth in the snows of the Ardennes. The Americans they had mocked were not the same soldiers who had landed on the beaches of Normandy. They were harder now, colder, and utterly relentless. What had once been a game of strategy had turned into a test of endurance, and the Americans had endured. The collapse of the German offensive left behind a trail of ruin, stretching from the forests of the Ardennes to the border of the Reich itself. But for those on the ground, the aftermath was not a clean transition from battle to victory. It was chaos. The snow-covered fields that had echoed with artillery fire were now littered with bodies, wrecked vehicles, and the remnants of a shattered army. The German officers who had once marched with pride were now struggling just to survive. Their once glorious divisions were in tatters, communications severed, fuel exhausted, morale destroyed. Many had no choice but to abandon their tanks, burning them before retreating on foot through the freezing woods. For the Americans, the reality of what they had endured was only beginning to sink in. The men of the 101st, 82nd and 2nd Divisions trudged through snow that was red in places, carrying rifles crusted with ice and faces darkened with smoke and exhaustion. The laughter and bravado of early December had long vanished. They had fought for weeks in bitter cold, often with little sleep and less food. Some soldiers wrapped their feet in spare rags to fight frostbite. Others marched in silence, too numb to feel pride. They had survived not through superior tactics or numbers alone, but through stubborn willpower, the kind that doesn't make it into the history books, but wins wars nonetheless. When the Americans began their counterattack in January 1945, the Germans were in full retreat. Roads clogged with broken vehicles and panicked soldiers trying to reach safety. Allied air superiority turned every column into a death trap. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs swept down in relentless waves, strafing and bombing anything that moved. Villagers watched from shattered windows as the once feared Wehrmacht fled eastward under skies thick with Allied aircraft. For many German soldiers, there was no longer a question of victory. It was about getting home alive. Among the German officers, panic turned to disbelief. Reports from the front painted a picture of total disaster. Regiments reduced to platoons, tanks stranded without fuel, and bridges blown to slow the American advance. Many of these same officers had laughed only weeks earlier, mocking the Americans as disorganized and soft. Now they watched as those same soldiers pressed forward with terrifying momentum. What they saw wasn't chaos. It was discipline forged in hardship. The Americans had adapted. Every mistake made in Normandy and the Hurtgen Forest had been learned from. They were no longer an inexperienced army. They were professionals. Captured German diaries and letters from this period reveal the shock and respect that began to replace arrogance. One officer wrote, "The Americans fight differently. They are not as afraid of dying as we thought. They keep coming even when we destroy their first wave." Another admitted, "They have courage. Perhaps not the courage of the Prussian soldier, but something else, something colder. This realization hit the German high command like a silent blow. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered, not by numbers or luck, but by men who refused to quit. Meanwhile, American engineers and medics worked tirelessly to restore what the battle had destroyed. Roads had to be cleared, bridges rebuilt, and villages searched for survivors. In the aftermath of battle, acts of humanity began to surface among the horror. Soldiers shared rations with Belgian villagers whose homes had been destroyed. Medics treated German wounded with the same care as their own. Chaplains buried the dead, American and German alike, in makeshift cemeteries marked with wooden crosses. The war had stripped away the illusions of superiority on both sides. Now what remained was the shared suffering of men caught in history's deadliest storm. For the German officers captured in the aftermath, defeat was almost impossible to comprehend. Many had been trained since their youth to believe that Germany could never lose a war. Sitting in American prisoner of war camps, they stared at the faces of the men they had mocked. The GIs were younger than they expected, more casual in their behavior, laughing, smoking, writing letters home. And yet beneath that easy demeanor, there was a toughness the Germans had failed to see before. One captured officer later recalled, "We thought them lazy, but they fought with the endurance of machines." As American tanks rolled eastward, the towns that had once fallen under German control now echoed with a new kind of sound, the rumble of liberation. Civilians emerged from cellars and barns waving makeshift flags, tears streaming down their faces as they greeted their liberators. The soldiers who had been dismissed as amateurs were now heroes in the eyes of those they freed. But for most GIs there was no celebration. The war was not yet over. Ahead lay the Siegfried Line, the Rhine, and the heart of Germany itself. Yet even as they pushed forward, stories of the Ardennes spread through the ranks. The tale of Bastogne, the defiance of nuts, the bitter cold and frozen foxholes, all became part of an unspoken legend that defined the spirit of the American army. The men didn't call themselves heroes. They didn't think in terms of glory or vengeance. They thought of survival, of brothers who didn't make it back, of nights spent in the snow wondering if the sun would ever rise again. On the German side, silence settled where laughter had once been. The officers who survived now faced the grim reality that their war was lost, not just on the battlefield, but in spirit. Their arrogance had blinded them to the truth that courage and strength are not born from uniform or nationality, but from endurance. They had underestimated an army built not on tradition, but on determination. And that mistake would cost them everything. The snows of the Ardennes melted slowly, revealing the scars of battle, the broken helmets, the burnt-out tanks, the empty rifles. For the Americans, it was the turning point of the European war, the moment when the question of victory ceased to exist. For the Germans, it was the reckoning. The officers who had once laughed at the GIs had met them in battle and learned too late that courage doesn't wear insignia. It simply endures. When the guns finally fell silent across the Ardennes, Europe seemed to exhale after months of chaos. The forests that had once echoed with the thunder of artillery now stood eerily quiet. Smoke drifted lazily through the shattered branches, and the frozen ground, scarred by craters and tracks, was littered with the wreckage of two armies. For the German officers who survived, there was no glory left to cling to. Their plans, their pride, their confidence, all had been buried under the snow. What they had believed impossible had happened. The Americans had not only held the line, but broken the back of the last great German offensive of the war. In the weeks that followed, German command structures began to crumble. Hitler's dream of splitting the Allied front and forcing a negotiated peace was dead. The Ardennes had drained the Reich's last reserves of men, tanks, and fuel. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. Experienced officers, many of them veterans of earlier campaigns, now found themselves leading remnants, fragments of units too weak to hold a line, too disorganized to resist. The survivors trudged eastward through the snow, haunted by memories of failure. Behind them, the Americans advanced relentlessly, their tanks cutting through the remnants of what was once the most feared army in the world. For the GIs, the victory was costly. They had fought through some of the harshest conditions of the war, against an enemy that refused to surrender easily. Thousands of men had died in frozen foxholes, in ambushes along narrow roads, or in towns that were little more than piles of rubble. But they had done what no one thought possible. They had stood their ground against Germany's best and turned them back. The laughter and arrogance that had echoed from German command posts in the early days of the offensive were gone, replaced by disbelief and exhaustion. In American headquarters, the sense of pride was tempered by grim realism. The Battle of the Bulge had proven that the enemy, though wounded, was still dangerous. But it had also revealed something else, something deeper. The Americans had proven that they were no longer the inexperienced newcomers the Germans had once mocked. They had become hardened soldiers, capable of adapting, enduring, and winning under impossible conditions. The amateurs had become veterans, and the veterans had become legends. Across the Atlantic, newspapers carried headlines of victory. The world read of Bastogne, of Patton's charge through the snow, of the defiance of the 101st Airborne. Families wept with pride and sorrow, knowing that many of their sons would never return. Yet their sacrifice had meaning. It marked the turning point that would lead to the fall of Nazi Germany just months later. The men who had faced mockery and doubt had proven themselves in the ultimate test of war. And history would remember them not as inexperienced soldiers, but as the saviors of Europe. For the Germans, the emotional reckoning was far harsher. In their letters home, those that survived, many officers wrote with a tone of disbelief. They confessed that the Americans had fought with a kind of quiet determination they had not expected. One wrote, "They are not refined soldiers, but they fight with a stubbornness that frightens me. They don't stop." Others admitted that the discipline and morale of their own men had begun to crack under the relentless pressure of the American counterattack. The myth of German invincibility, built over 6 years of conquest, had finally collapsed. As spring approached, the tide of war swept eastward toward the Rhine. The Americans who had fought in the Ardennes now marched through towns that bore the scars of Germany's collapsing empire. Villagers stared in silence as columns of tanks passed by, their barrels blackened from battle. Among the prisoners captured along the way were the very officers who had once laughed at the green Americans. Their faces were hollow now, their uniforms tattered. Some refused to speak. Others, when confronted by young GIs, offered quiet nods of respect. It was a strange, silent acknowledgement, an understanding born from battle that the war had changed them all. In American camps, victory did not bring celebration so much as reflection. The men wrote letters home, describing the cold, the fear, and the brothers they had lost. Many spoke of the German soldiers they had fought, not as faceless enemies, but as men caught in the same nightmare. War had stripped away ideology, leaving only survival and memory. The laughter that had once defined arrogance had been replaced by silence, a silence that would follow both sides for the rest of their lives. When historians later studied the Battle of the Bulge, they often focused on its scale, its strategy, its numbers. But the real story lay in the human transformation that occurred beneath the snow and fire. The Americans had entered the Ardennes as ordinary soldiers, mechanics, farmers, factory workers, students, and emerged as a force that even the Wehrmacht could no longer dismiss. They had proven that courage doesn't depend on experience, that strength isn't measured by reputation, and that victory belongs not to the proud, but to the persistent. For the German officers who had mocked them, the war ended not with laughter, but with surrender. Many were captured, others killed, and a few lived long enough to write memoirs that spoke of the shock they felt in facing an army they had underestimated. They fought with the heart of lions, one former panzer officer wrote years later. We thought they were untrained, undisciplined, but they were something worse for us, unbreakable. By the time the Americans crossed the Rhine and advanced into the heart of Germany, the story of the Ardennes had become legend among the Allied troops. It was not just a victory, it was a redemption. The Germans had believed that industrial soldiers could never outfight the warrior, tradition of the Reich, but the men from small towns and big cities across America had proved that courage could come from anywhere. As the snow melted and Europe prepared for the final push toward Berlin, the truth of that winter remained clear. Arrogance had fallen and endurance had triumphed. The German officers who once laughed at the GIs had met them in battle, and it was the laughter that died first.